Our next guest is a front runner in digitization of our society, and Chris Booth gave us a very good start, and it's a great interlinkage here. Carla Hustedt, she's head of the digital center of the Mercator Stiftung, an independent foundation, and there she is dealing with topics around ethics of algorithms, digital public, so she's talking about she's also researching and dealing with the public aspects of AI. And Chris also mentioned the society and our human attributes into AI, and I think that's a largely important topic. She's also dealing with climate and digitization and how to push the Energiewende, so how to solve our climate crisis. And now, let's welcome Carla Hustedt with her speech, Is AI Evil?
Hi, everybody. Also, hi to everybody in the stream. This is not the best spot right after the coffee break, when everybody's enjoying for the first time, meeting again, getting into conversations. But I'm really happy to be here and to be here physically and to actually look into faces and not just at my computer. Is AI evil? If you would pose this question to a group of science fiction writers, the majority would probably answer yes. We all know these stories about sentient AI taking over control, and it's very easy to get lost in these fantasies of super intelligent robots rebelling against their human creators and trying to kill humans. I think, however, that these kind of images, these characters, tell us a lot about human fears, but very little about the actual dangers of modern technology like artificial intelligence. I believe that instead of fearing that AI will become sentient, that it will become super intelligent and rebel against humans, I believe that we should fear that the already powerful humans will use this technology as a tool and as a weapon to further consolidate their power, and that this trend will lead to further inequalities and that it can be threatening for our democracies. Which is why I won't talk about this guy today, but instead I will talk about us humans. And something that wasn't said in the introduction is that I grew up with technology. My dad had a computer store when I was small, and my first job was actually formatting floppy disks. So I was surrounded by technology from an early stage, and I believe in all the positive potentials of technology. But I also started in academics, I started my research on inequalities. I'm actually a political scientist. So I look at the different ways human structures, institutions reproduce inequalities and how we can work against it. So what I want to talk about today is the human causes for evil AI. And I've created a categorization, and I've brought some examples for all the three categories, which are humans using AI for what you could call evil purposes, problematic purposes, purposefully destroying democratic structures, humans using AI for profit, but also putting profit over human rights, and humans using AI with good intentions, but in a really bad way. And we heard a lot about China today and how it's starting to take over the AI market, but something we haven't really talked about is how since 2013 the Chinese government is subjecting 13 million Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnic minorities to mass arbitrary detention, to political oppression, oppression of religion, and freedom of movement is also suppressed. And what we're witnessing in China, and what maybe a lot of us are not seeing, is actually that this is the biggest internation of an ethnic minority since the fall of the Third Reich. And a lot of this is actually happening with the help of modern technology, and in particularly AI. There's a lot of research by NGOs, nonprofit organizations like Human Rights Watch, that have, for example, analyzed the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which is the main system for mass surveillance in China and which is particularly used for the oppression of the Uyghur minority. And what Human Rights Watch found is that this system aggregates data on information like blood type, height of people, what kind of packages they order, or their electricity usage. And when it finds something suspicious, it alerts the police and they act. And in many of these countries, what we are seeing right now is how the original promise of the internet as a force of liberation, as a force for human rights, is actually turned around. And what scares me the most is actually that we are seeing more and more countries adopting this model of digital authoritarianism across the world. According to Freedom House, the internet freedom has actually decreased now in 2021 for 11 years in a row. In many of these countries, social media are actually the only place where people can get access to neutral information, where they can connect, where they can organize for social purposes, but also for opposition, for political purposes. And particularly in the corona pandemic, we've all profited from social media. It allowed us to stay in contact despite restrictions to stay informed. And like I said, I think digitization is never particularly bad or good. We always need to look at the gray tones. And the same goes for social networks like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so on. You see on the right here Frances Haugen. She's an American computer scientist and she's a former product manager at Facebook. And she just revealed a lot of information on social networks because at the very latest, since her revelations, we know not only how social media can be harmful for us as individuals, but we also know that they know and that they don't do much about it. Haugen revealed that Facebook has known for years that its algorithm is actually steering young people towards toxic content. For example, if a young person is Googling for healthy recipes, the Instagram algorithm after a while starts to show them content that is related to anorexia. And Haugen also showed that Facebook has known this information, and she published documents from meetings with Mark Zuckerberg where he decided not to take measures that would limit the spread of this toxic content and the spread of misinformation, because at the same time, these measures would have also limited interaction. Social media companies are not per se interested in the downfall or the weakening of democracy, just like tobacco companies are not interested in people dying. But we still need to understand that they make profit with our addiction. They make profit, in the words of Frances Haugen, with hate and with anger. And they sometimes accept the downfalls and the weakening of democracies if that means they can make more profit. In those two cases, we see how the great advancements of AI can be threatening for human rights and for democracy. But in many of the cases that I've analyzed in the past years, the problem is actually not that AI is performing particularly well, but it's the opposite. It's AI being pretty stupid. And even more problematic, it's humans not being able to detect that stupidity because they believe in this strong intelligence. Which is why the last example I brought to you actually comes from the Netherlands, where in 2013, the Dutch tax authorities started to introduce a system to detect wrong applications for like social money for children, for parents, and to detect fraud. And the system was in use for 5 years before it came to public attention that the system had actually wrongly accused 26,000 parents for having received social security money, child service money, and so on. For a lot of these parents, this meant that they received letters stating that they owe sometimes 10,000s of euros to the government. And what makes all of this even more problematic is that it was revealed that a lot of the families were actually from already social, problematic backgrounds, people who had less access to financial means, and more people with migration background were affected. And there's research now from the Dutch Data Protection Authority that looked at how the racial inequality that was already existent in the system before was baked into the self-learning algorithmic system that was used by the tax authorities. And what they found was many causes, one of them being that, for example, a dual citizenship was identified as a risk factor for fraud. Another problem they found was that the system was optimized to not miss any case of fraud at the expense of accepting quite a lot of cases of false positives. And the Dutch minister, the ministry tried to hide these mistakes for quite a while, but then at the end, the scandal led to the step down of the whole cabinet of Mark Rutte in 2021. So this shows how big the backlash against such a system, once it becomes public, can actually be. What I find particularly interesting and in a way scary about this case is that whenever a case was flagged by the system, you actually had social workers in place who had to also check the case manually. But they were not given any explanation whatsoever how the system worked and how it came to its risk score. So we literally had to deal with a black box system here. And this is actually, of all the three, the one that sometimes worries me the most, because it happens to me so many times that I'm sitting on panels and people are saying, oh, maybe democracies aren't fit for the digital age. Maybe we can't do it. And cases like this actually lead to this kind of question. They make people lose trust in technology and in democracy. The good news, since it's humans who are the problem behind evil AI, it's also humans who can solve it. And luckily, as somebody working in philanthropy, I'm not just paid to analyze the problems, but also to fund solutions. And I'm an optimist, so I brought to you some examples that actually give me hope that we can get this problem under control, as long as we all work together. People from business, people from civil society, people from science, politicians. It's great to see you all in this room, because I really think that we can only do this with joint effort. These are the headlines from, I think it was 2020, after it became public that facial recognition is very good in detecting the faces of white men and not so good at detecting the faces of people of color or women. In addition, a lot of people had raised the problematic impact of facial recognition technology for democracy. So a couple of tech companies actually reacted and said, we will no longer sell facial recognition to governments. And of course, this doesn't mean that China will now stop using facial recognition. They're actually developing systems that are particularly good at identifying the faces of Uyghur minorities. But I still like this example because it actually shows how civil society and scientists who actually brought this problem to attention can work together with businesses and can make a difference. Another way that I think tech companies can help us create better technology for democracy is by making their teams more diverse, bring more different perspectives to the table, people who will help identify these problems at an earlier stage. And I'm very proud to be part of an initiative that's called She Transforms IT, which actually brings together leaders from science, from business, from civil society to actually raise the awareness on the need for more diversity in tech and to also make role models visible. And I really like this tweet by Vala Afshar, who's a chief digital evangelist at Salesforce, because it shows that when we're looking for role models in tech, we sometimes don't just need to look around us, but sometimes we can even look in the past. And we just need to remember that computer science actually used to be a very female working place. As I said before, a lot of these problems only get public attention because of the endless work of civil society. And most of the projects that I fund are actually NGOs, civil society organizations that write reports, that dig really deep, that do research on why these problems happen, and that try to raise awareness. And who you see on the right here is Joy Buolamwini. Some of you might by now know her from Netflix. There's a documentary about her work. And I think that was like 5 years ago when people weren't really talking about this topic in Europe yet. She published, she did a TED Talk actually on the biasness of facial recognition technology. She's herself a researcher at MIT focusing on facial recognition. And she had realized that those systems that she was working with couldn't detect her own face. And she created a database to find out whether there was a problem with her face or whether there was maybe a systematic issue. And she realized that the leaders in facial recognition technology at that time, IBM, Face++, Microsoft, all had problems with detecting the faces of women and people of color. On the right here, you see one of the organizations that we're supporting institutionally, their growth, their organizational development, Algorithm Watch. They're one of the front runners, I would say, in Europe, working on these topics. And you can see the team here. They've grown a lot in the last year, which makes me really happy, because they've played a key role in raising awareness on how these developments are not just happening in the US and China, but actually over here in Europe. And they publish once a year the Automating Society report. In my last job at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, I had the pleasure to work on this report with them, where they brought together 16 journalists from different European countries to do research on cases of AI application across Europe. They did a great comic book on this topic as well, so I can highly recommend it. We're also giving them funding to take part in policy processes. As you know, there's a lot of discussion right now on the European AI Act, and something that we are seeing is that these political discussions, the meetings with politicians, MEPs, are largely dominated by big tech, that a lot of money is flowing into lobbying in this industry, that actually by now big tech is spending more money on lobbying in Brussels than the automobile industry or the pharma industry. So what we're trying to create is a counterweight. I'm not saying they shouldn't have a say, but it should be a diverse debate. So we're trying to create a counterweight of civil society voices. There's a lot of things that we actually don't know yet when it comes to the societal impact of AI, which is why, of course, science needs to play a role, not just in the development of AI, but also in looking at how it affects our society and coming up with solutions. And what you see here is a picture from a project that we funded. It was actually one of the first in our program at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute, which is a research institute focusing on societal questions of digitization here in Berlin. And it was a cooperation with the Digital Asia Hub and the Berkman Klein Center, where they brought together scientists from different countries, different disciplines, to work in also quite, I would say, modern research methods, research sprints, very applied cases to come up with solutions, for example, how to make AI transparent, how to avoid cases like the one in the Netherlands, or the question of how you can actually democratize decisions made in social networks. And we were very lucky to have Frank-Walter Steinmeier, our president, as a patron in this project, which I think is very important, because we need political attention for these topics. We need politicians to understand that this is a topic that will shape the world we live in, our future. Which brings me to the last stakeholder group, politicians, government. What can they do? And since I talked so negatively about what happened in the Netherlands, I thought I would also bring a positive example from there. What you see here is a screenshot from Amsterdam's algorithmic system register. And what they did is the city of Amsterdam created a website, quite simple actually, where they publish cases. They make it available for researchers, but also for every citizen. And they describe what purposes they use the systems for, if they've worked with scientists, maybe what kind of risk assessments they've made, and so on. So they actually make it transparent in the true meaning of the word. They're not just publishing code that nobody can deal with, but they're trying to explain the thinking behind applying the system. And I think this is a really great example, and it's not that hard to adopt and duplicate in other places. Governments, of course, don't just use technology, they also regulate it. And I know that a lot of people from the business sector, startups, are right now watching the process that is happening in Europe, also maybe with a little bit of fear of over-regulation. We heard a lot today how Europe is really behind, and we all know that just regulation alone won't solve it. So we will need modern regulation that promotes both innovation, allows spaces for trying out things, but still puts human rights, the protection of human rights, in the focus. So I was really happy when I saw that the European Commission developed a risk-based regulation. Ayosha, who is here in the audience, who was part of the German Parliament's AI on Cat Commission, that had also recommended this system, where there's different levels of regulation depending on the risk an AI system poses for human rights and society. So there will be a lot of space for trying out things when your AI system ends up in the bottom of the pyramid and it's a minimal risk. But there will be a lot of restrictions for systems that are at the top of the pyramid at unacceptable risk. I think, however, that we can all agree that if a system decides over access to education, who gets which treatment in a hospital, or childcare benefits, that it should actually apply to a lot of oversight accountability. So I'm quite happy seeing the developments that are happening here. I just had a chat with Tanya, who will sit on the panel that will follow right after my speech before. And what I liked was, she's going to say a little bit more about that later, that she's looking at possible futures. Because what I did today is I talked a lot about the risks and the causes behind the risks. And I think that's important, that we become aware about the power dynamics behind these problems. But we also need to come up with new ideas. We cannot leave the discussion of what kind of world we're going to live in to big tech platforms and authoritarian regimes. So I'm optimistic that we can limit the evil AI, that we can actually make sure that it's used for good purposes, for the strengthening of democratic structures, if we work together, if we don't get lost in the fantasies of super evil, intelligent AI rebelling against humans, if we understand that solutions are never entirely technical, that we're actually dealing with socio-economic systems, and if we all work together, if we open ourselves for conversations also between different sectors, disciplines, and countries. So I look forward to having a couple of more chats in the coffee break later. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, so much. We are running a bit out of time, but I have one more question to you. Because the one thing I was missing is, in terms of ethical and digital society, is this topic of biased coding. So do you have a perspective on biased coding? My background is, of course, that 70% of coders are white males, and then the rest is Indian males. So what about biased coding?
I mean, I think that when we look at examples where there's bias in the outcome, and I mean, I presented some like facial recognition systems where the problem lies in the data set, or the Dutch example actually, there's like multiple sources. Sometimes it's the goal that was set by, for example, the government, sometimes it's the data itself, sometimes it's the code, sometimes it's the way an output is actually interpreted by, for example, a social worker. So the first step would always be to look at what is the source of the problem, but of course to also put in some friction maybe between the development and the implementation status. And I know we want to do this all really fast, and there's a lot of potential that we can still use, but sometimes some friction is good because it helps us to find these issues. So that's really what I'm hoping for. And to be honest, there's a lot of solutions already out there on how to make data less biased, for example, or how to debias the code. We just need to make sure that it's actually used. And that's the problem I see at the moment.